And why is Hegel the enemy? Well, Hegel basically is his enemy because Hegel preached the idea that mankind's deepest need is self-knowledge. That's the ultimate premise of Hegelianism. And you can understand history and culture as a quest for self-knowledge. Well, what happens when the quest for self-knowledge ends? Well, then history and culture come to an end. Hegel believed that history and culture had come to an end in his time, basically with him. He had arrived at an absolute moment at which he could look back at the course of history and culture up to his time and understand its meaning better than the people who came before him. Now, Hegel believed that man doesn't exist in nature. Man is a historical being. So when history begins, we have the beginning of mankind. The unspoken assumption, though, is that when history ends, that's somehow the end of man. Hegel wanted to paint it as like man's fulfillment, but Nietzsche looked at that and he thought, no, if man begins in history and history ends, then we have the end of man. And what is the end of man? Well, that's what Nietzsche talked about later when he talked about the last man. And basically what Nietzsche is describing as the end of history is nihilism, that meaning ceases, basically, that nothing has any power over people that's higher than their desires and their calculations of prudence. And so the end of history is a time when basically all cultural ideals are known. People can look back at them, but they become objectified. They don't have a claim on us anymore. They don't have any power over us anymore. We don't feel obligated to them in any sense. We've stepped aside from all of this history stuff. We've stepped aside from all the struggles of history. And our relationship to history and culture is now that of a theorist. We're looking back at it and we're understanding it as objects. And if it's an object to us, it's not part of us. It doesn't claim us. And therefore, there's a certain lack of commitment. Well, there's no commitment at all anymore. There's objectivity, there's theory, but there's no commitment. There's no partiality. And Nietzsche believed that that led to the collapse of values and culture and the collapse of meaning and basically ushering in a time of nihilism. So the end of history basically is the end of culture, the end of struggle, the end of ideals, and the beginning of meaninglessness. And what does one do when society becomes meaningless? When God dies? That's how he puts it later. The death of God is the beginning of nihilism. Well, one is left basically to navigate by one's passions, one's desires, the things that don't set us apart from the animals. Of course, though, we do have this rational faculty. We do have all these artifacts, these heirlooms of culture and history. And one of the things that we do is we use our reason in a calculating way to satisfy our desires. And, we mix and match and consume the products of history. They don't have any power over us anymore, but they are beautiful or interesting. And so we want to consume them, just as we want to consume bread and wine and so forth. And Nietzsche thought that that was a profoundly empty form of life and that it would lead eventually to a crisis of culture. And he was describing this crisis of culture in the 1870s.